All right, let's do this. Today, we're going to tackle planning permission for construction. You want to know how it all works? And we've got a ton of info to help us sort it out.
Yeah, it can seem pretty overwhelming at first, but it all comes down to making sure that buildings, new and old, they're built and changed in a way that works for everybody. Kind of like playing Tetris, but with buildings. Got to make sure everything fits right.
Tetris with buildings, I like that. So it's not just a free-for-all, build whatever you want, wherever. Okay, so for someone in the UK, what's like the first thing they need to know about planning permission?
The big thing to remember is that in the UK, if you're building, you probably need planning permission. It's the law. And it's all laid out in the Town and Country Planning Act of 1990.
The Town and Country Planning Act of 1990.
Got it.
So that's like the rule book, the foundation of the whole process.
You got it. It's the bedrock, yeah. That act makes sure that any development, any building, it's done in a way that's, controlled, sustainable.
Ah.
It considers a lot of things like what it'll do to the environment, what the community needs, and, all those big sustainable development goals we hear about.
Right, because a new building, it doesn't exist in isolation. It affects everything around it. So let's say someone wants to, I don't know, build a fancy new extension on their house. What's the first step?
Before they get too excited, get out the blueprints, they should talk to their local planning authority. We call them the LPA.
The LPA, okay. Is this like a casual chat or is it a more formal thing?
It's more about gathering info. The homeowner can, throw some ideas around, get a feel for whether the project might be approved.
Yeah.
And the LPA can tell them about any specific rules or policies that might apply, locally.
So it's about getting a lay of the land before diving into the whole application process.
Yeah, exactly. The LPA will tell them things like, does the extension they want fall under permitted development? Which means sometimes they might not need full planning permission.
Permitted development. That's interesting. Sounds like a shortcut for smaller projects.
Yeah, it can be. But let's say this homeowner, their extension is a little bigger, a bit more ambitious, they'll need the full planning permission. So after that chat with the LPA, they've got to prepare the application.
Time to get serious.
Yeah.
What does a planning application actually look like? What goes into it?
It's about giving the LPA a really clear picture of what they want to build. So detailed plans, drawings, usually done by an architect, showing, the size, design, materials, how it'll connect to the existing house.
So no back-of-the-napkin sketches allowed.
Haha, nope. They
Yeah.
need to be precise, accurate, plus a design and access statement explaining their choices, how it fits into the neighborhood, things like access for disabled people.
Makes sense. It's got to fit in with what's already there. I'm guessing there's a fee too, right?
There is, an application fee. It varies depending on the project, how complex it is. Think of it as, an investment, making sure everything's done right.
Fair enough. Okay, so application submitted, all the I's dotted, T's crossed. What happens then? Does the LPA just disappear with it all and make a decision?
Actually, no. One of the most important parts is that the public gets to weigh in. The LPA makes the application public, so neighbors, anyone interested, can give their opinion.
The community has a voice. I bet that can get interesting sometimes if people have concerns.
Yeah, definitely. The homeowner might get feedback about things like, will the extension block someone's sunlight? Will it impact privacy, traffic? It's all about making sure the project's viewed from, all sides.
Right. Get everyone's perspective before making a decision that affects the whole neighborhood.
Yeah.
Okay, the LPA gathers all the feedback, then what?
Then comes the decision time. The LPA looks at everything, the application, the plans, what the public said, and checks it against, local planning rules and national guidelines, like the National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF.
NPPF, another acronym for the list. What is this NPPF? Why is it important?
Think of it like the guiding principles, the rules of thumb for good planning in England. It stresses things like, sustainable development, making sure the community's involved, creating places that are well-designed, places people want to live in.
So it's kind of like a checklist for the LPA, making sure they're thinking big picture.
Exactly. Got to tick all the boxes. And then, after all that, they make their decision. They can approve it outright, approve it with conditions, or sometimes they refuse permission.
Decision time. I bet that waiting is nerve-wracking for the homeowner. Let's say they get lucky, permission's granted. Can they start building right away?
Well, hold on. Even when they say yes, there might be conditions. It's the LPA's way of, minimizing any negative effects, making sure things are done right.
So it's like a set of guidelines, keep the project on track.
Exactly. It could be things like, what materials they can use, specific design details, or even what hours they can build to minimize disruption.
Right. It's not just getting the Yes, it's following through in a way that works for everyone.
Mhm.
Okay, so they've got permission, maybe with a few conditions. What's the next hurdle?
Now it's building control's turn. Building regulations, they set the standards for how buildings are built in the UK, making sure they're safe, sustainable. Planning permissions about location, impact. Building control is about the building itself. Is it up to code?
Two separate things, but both important. Is it another application, another set of fees?
It can be separate, but they're linked. You usually show that you'll meet building regulations as part of the planning application, but the approval for that might come later.
Okay, got it. Before we get lost in building control, let's rewind a bit. You mentioned permitted development, how some projects might not need full planning permission. What kind of projects are we talking about?
Permitted development, it covers, well, smaller things that are generally low impact, like small extensions, loft conversions, as long as they don't change the roofline much. Some internal work, too.
So it's like a fast track for less, I don't know, dramatic home improvements?
Yeah.
But how do you know if your project qualifies?
It's all in the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Order, the GPDO. Bit of a mouthful, but it's actually pretty useful. And, the LPA can tell you during that initial chat we talked about.
ELPA, always there to help us through this maze. Okay, so our homeowner, they're doing this extension. What would the LPA look for in terms of this permitted development?
They'd look at things like, how big is the extension? How tall is it? How close to the boundaries of the property? There are limits on, the materials, how much of the original house it covers.
So it's not a complete free pass.
Right.
Still rules to follow, even with permitted development.
Absolutely. And even if something technically qualifies, there can be exceptions. If the house is, say, in a conservation area or it's a listed building, the rules can be stricter.
Conservation areas, listed buildings. What are those and why the special rules?
They're about protecting our heritage, the buildings and places that make a place special. Conservation areas, they're areas that have a special architectural or historic feel. Listed buildings, those are individual buildings that have been officially recognized for their importance architecturally or historically.
Right, got to preserve those historic features. So our homeowner, if their house falls under one of those categories, they might have some extra hoops to jump through.
Yeah, they might need more detailed plans. They might have to explain their design choices more carefully, show that what they want to do won't harm the character of the area or the building itself.
I get it. No slapping a modern glass box onto a Victorian townhouse, right?
Yeah.
So let's say our homeowner, they've either followed the permitted development rules or they've gone through the full planning permission process. Everything's approved, conditions met, time to break ground. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, haha, even with the best of intentions, sometimes things don't quite go to plan. That's where we get into the world of planning appeals and enforcement.
Ooh, that sounds juicy. But before we get into all that drama, let's talk more about the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework. You mentioned it earlier.
Yeah, the NPPF, the rule book, the guiding principles for every planning decision in England. It's a really interesting document, really gets into what good planning should be all about.
Okay, lay it on me. What are some of the key principles, things our homeowners should know about, especially with this extension?
One of the big ones is the presumption in favor of sustainable development.
Sustainable development, we hear that a lot. What does it actually mean in the context of, a house extension?
It's about finding that balance between economic growth, social well-being, and protecting the environment. So our homeowner, they'd have to show how their extension contributes to all of those.
So it's not just about building a nice new space, it's about the bigger picture, the impact.
Exactly. And the NPTF, it really pushes the importance of good design, creating places that, people actually want to live in that look good.
So no tacking on a boring, boxy extension that clashes with the original house.
No, definitely not. They want people to think carefully about, the materials they use, how it affects the surrounding area. Does it add to the character of the street?
It's about improving the neighborhood, not just adding square footage. Love that.
Yeah.
Anything else in the NPPF we should know about?
It talks a lot about how important it is to get the community involved. Remember that public consultation we talked about? That's a big part of that.
Right, letting everyone have their say. Okay, so NPPF, it's about the community, the environment, good design. But it's not just big picture stuff.
Yeah.
It gets into specifics too.
Oh, absolutely. It covers, tons of things. Housing, design, transport, infrastructure, all of it. And it's a living document, always changing to reflect, new priorities, new challenges.
Makes sense. Construction's always changing. Okay, so we've got the Town and Country Planning Act, the NPPF, the LPA. But You mentioned something about strategic and non-strategic policies. How do those fit into this whole thing?
It's about different levels of planning. Think of strategic policies like the big picture stuff. They're in the local plans, which cover a larger area. They're about things like how much housing does an area need? Where will jobs come from? How will the infrastructure support it all?
So the strategic policies, they set the stage for what's possible in an area.
Yeah, exactly. Then you've got the non-strategic policies, which are more like specific, more local. Things like what are the design standards? How much parking is needed? How should new buildings fit in with the environment? You'll find these in like supplementary planning documents or neighborhood plans.
So it's a hierarchy of rules. Strategic ones set the direction, and non-strategic ones are the more detailed guidelines.
Yeah, great way to put it. And for our homeowner with their extension, both levels of policies apply. The LPA checks their application against both the big picture vision and the more local, detailed rules.
So it's about fitting into the big picture ain't of the local context. Got it.
Yeah, precisely. And this brings us to another interesting piece of legislation, the Localism Act.
The Localism Act. Okay, what does that bring to the party?
It's all about giving local communities more power, letting them have more say in how their neighborhoods develop.
Power to the people. How does that actually work?
Well, the Localism Act, it brought in things like neighborhood plans. Those are plans that the community itself creates, laying out their vision for how they want their area to develop.
Just like a community-driven blueprint for their neighborhood.
Exactly. And once a neighborhood plan's approved, through a local vote, it becomes, well, official. The LPA has to consider it when making decisions.
That's pretty cool. Gives the community a real voice in shaping where they live.
Absolutely. It fits right in with the NPPF's emphasis on community involvement. The Localism Act also encourages communities to use community right to build orders. That lets them basically grant planning permission themselves for specific projects they support. Sometimes they can even skip the usual application process.
So it's cutting through the red tape, giving communities more control.
Yeah, that's the idea. Shifting the balance of power, letting communities really shape their own future.
Seems like the Localism Act adds another layer of complexity to all this, but in a good way. It's about making the whole process more collaborative, more responsive to what people want.
Exactly. And remember, even with all these frameworks, rules, regulations, there's still the human element. People have different opinions, different priorities, and, well, they might interpret the rules differently.
Right, because at the end of the day, this is all about people living and working in these spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens when those different opinions clash? When there's a disagreement about a development or someone just builds without permission? That's when things get really interesting.
You said it. Buckle up, because next we're diving into the world of planning appeals and enforcement. Things can get a little dramatic. Okay, so picture this. Our homeowner's extension. It's causing a stir amongst the neighbors. Maybe someone's worried about their view or the trees they've got, or maybe it's worries about more traffic on the street.
Yeah, the classic neighborly drama. So what happens when someone's not happy with the LPA's decision? Whether it's the homeowner themselves or a concerned neighbor, what can they do?
That's where the appeals process comes in. Both the person who applied and sometimes even just members of the public, they can appeal a planning decision.
So it's not a one-way street. You can challenge the decision if you think it was, I don't know, unfair or just wrong.
Exactly. The reasons you can appeal, they vary, but it usually comes down to showing that the LPA, maybe they didn't consider all the important stuff, maybe they used a policy incorrectly, or sometimes, yeah, the decision was just plain wrong.
So it's not just, I don't like it, I'm appealing. You need a good reason.
Yeah, definitely. Can't just appeal based on feelings. You got to show there were actual errors, that the decision wasn't made properly.
And who handles these appeals? Is it the LPA again?
Nope. Appeals go to the planning inspectorate. They're independent. They look at the whole thing fresh, and they make the final call.
So there's like a system of checks and balances, make sure things are fair.
Yeah.
What does this appeal process actually involve? Is it all paperwork work, or is there more to it?
It depends, how complex the case is. Sometimes, yeah, it's just written statements. Both sides lay out their arguments, the evidence. But sometimes it can be more like hearings, even public inquiries. That's when things can get a bit more intense. Imagine lawyers presenting evidence, people being questioned, a planning inspector in charge of it all.
Sounds like a courtroom drama. And the inspector's decision, is that the end of it? Or can you keep appealing forever?
Usually what the inspector says, that's it. It's binding. There are some very specific situations where you can go to court, but that's not common.
Okay, so the appeals process, it's there to make sure decisions are looked at carefully and that you have a way to challenge them if you need to. But what about the other side of things? When someone just decides, forget the rules, I'm building anyway, what happens then? Is it just a slap on the wrist, or is it more serious?
That's where we get into planning enforcement. And yeah, it's not something to take lightly. It's the LPA's job to investigate when someone builds without permission, or if they ignore the conditions that came with their permission.
So it's like the planning police are on the case. I bet there's some detective work involved, tracking down rogue builders and homeowners.
Haha, sometimes. It can be a bit like that. They might get complaints from neighbors, or they might spot it during their regular checks. And if they find something's not right, they've got different ways to enforce the rules.
Let's break it down. What can the LPA actually DO to someone who's broken the rules?
One of the most common things they do is issue an enforcement notice. It basically tells the developer, stop the work or fix what you did wrong, and they give them a deadline.
So it's like a stop right there.
Yeah.
From the planning authorities.
Yeah, exactly. And if they ignore that notice, things can get serious. They could be taken to court, they could get fined, sometimes even jail time.
Wow, those are some serious consequences. I bet that gets people's attention. Anything else they can do?
If it's really urgent, if there's a danger to the environment or the community, they can issue a stop notice. That halts the work immediately.
Like hitting the emergency brake on a project that's gone completely off the rails.
Yeah, good analogy. And in some cases, like extreme cases, they can even order that a building be demolished if it was built without permission.
Demolition. That sends a strong message. Planning rules are not to be messed with. Our sources mention a case, a pretty crazy one, about a couple who had to demolish their whole house because they built it without permission. What happened there?
Yeah, that was in Ireland. A couple, they built their dream home in County Galway, but they didn't get planning permission.
A dream home turned nightmare. Why did they build without permission? Were they trying to get away with something, or was it an honest mistake?
It's not totally clear. Seems like they did apply for permission, but it was refused. But instead of appealing or changing their plans, they just went ahead and built it anyway.
A risky move. And it didn't pay off, huh?
Nope. The local planning authority found out, issued an enforcement notice, and after a long legal battle all the way to the Supreme Court, they had to tear down their house.
Oh, wow. That's heartbreaking. It really shows how important it is to follow the rules. And if you're not sure, get some professional advice, right?
Absolutely. Even if you make a mistake, it's always better to work with the system, get the right guidance.
Yeah.
Buy safe than sorry.
Okay, so we've talked about planning permission, the application, the NPPF, the Localism Act, even the dramatic side of appeals and enforcement. But what about other legal stuff, safety stuff, that comes into play when you're building or changing a building? Not just planning permission, but the bigger picture.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider. One big one is building control and regulations. They're all about making sure the building itself is safe, sustainable, that it meets the standards, like the technical side of things, compared to planning permission.
Okay, let's get into building control. Is it a whole other application, more fees?
It can be separate from planning permission, but they're connected. Usually you have to show you'll meet building regulations as part of your planning application. But the actual building control approval, that might come later.
So it's like a two-step process, making sure the development is good for the location, A&D safe for the people inside.
Exactly. Building control, it covers a ton of stuff. Is the structure sound? Is it fire safe? Is it energy efficient? Can disabled people access it? Is it well insulated against sound? And a lot more.
Wow, a lot to think about. But it makes sense. Got to have rules to make sure buildings are safe for people, right?
Absolutely. Building regulations are there to prevent disasters, to protect people's health and safety.
I'm curious, how does it actually work? Are there inspectors, like, lurking around waiting to catch people breaking the rules?
Haha, not quite. There are two main ways to get building control approval: a full plans application and a building notice.
Options, okay. What's the difference?
Full plans application, that's the more thorough one. You submit your plans, all the details to the local authority or an approved inspector. They look at everything before you can start building.
So it's like your building plans get put through an exam.
Yeah, exactly. This is usually for bigger projects, more complex ones where the risks are higher.
And the building notice, that's the more relaxed option.
It's simpler, yeah. Often used for smaller projects like those extensions, renovations. You don't need to submit detailed plans right away, but you still got to follow the building regulations, and there will be inspections during and after the work.
So more flexible, but they're still checking.
Yeah, the main difference is how much detail you need up front.
Our sources mention something called approved documents connected to building regulations. What are those?
They're basically like detailed guides, instructions. They tell you how to meet the building regulations, like step-by-step manuals for how to build things right.
Okay, that sounds super helpful. I bet that saves a lot of headaches, having clear instructions.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The approved documents, they cover everything, from the foundations to fire safety. They explain all that technical jargon in plain English, give you practical tips on how to make sure your building's up to code.
Like having a building regulations expert by your side.
Uh-huh. Yeah, kinda. They're a great resource for anyone involved in construction, helps them understand the rules and build safe, sustainable buildings.
The sources also say that a lot of these building regulations, they came about because of tragedies, where things weren't built properly and bad things happened. Any examples that really show how important these rules are?
Oh, absolutely. Building regulations, they've changed over time, a lot of times because of, yeah, tragic events that showed where things went wrong.
Okay, let's go back in time a bit then.
One of the most famous is the Great Fire of London, back in 1666. That fire, it raged for days, destroyed huge parts of the city. It really showed how dangerous it was to have buildings made of wood and streets that were narrow and winding.
It's hard to imagine how devastating that must have been.
It was a turning point for building regulations. After the fire, they brought in new rules saying buildings had to be made of brick and stone, and the streets had to be wider to stop fires from spreading so quickly.
So a terrible event led to big improvements in building practices, fire safety. Any other examples?
Another one that comes to mind is the Ronan Point Tower block collapse back in 1968.
That sounds scary. What happened?
Ronan Point, it was a 22-story apartment building built with these prefabricated concrete panels. There was gas explosion on the 18th floor, and part of the building just collapsed. 4 people died, lots more were injured.
Oh no, that's awful. Really shows how important building safety is.
It was a wake-up call for the whole construction industry. The investigation showed that those concrete panels, they were just too weak, too easily damaged.
So they changed the building regulations after that.
Oh yeah, big changes.
Hmm.
Especially rules about how strong buildings have to be and how those prefabricated components should be used.
It's amazing how these regulations have changed over time because of these events.
Yeah, it's a constant learning process, right? Learning from mistakes, trying to make buildings safer, and it still happens today. The Grenfell Tower fire a few years ago, that led to a whole review of fire safety, especially for tall buildings.
Makes sense. Building methods change, materials change, the rules have to keep up.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, thinking ahead, and always trying to make things safer, more sustainable.
Now, something I'm curious about is the different safety standards for low-rise and medium-rise buildings. Why do we need different rules for different heights?
It makes sense when you think about it. Tall buildings, shorter buildings, they face different challenges, different risks. One set of rules for everything wouldn't really work.
Okay, let's break it down. First, how do building regulations define low-rise and medium-rise?
Usually low-rise is anything up to 3 stories, and medium-rise is like 4 to 10 stories.
Okay, so it's based on how many floors the building has. Makes sense. What are some of the main differences in the safety rules?
Fire safety, that's a big one. Low-rise buildings, they can have simpler rules. Often just one staircase is enough for people to escape.
Easy to imagine everyone getting out quickly.
Yeah, but for medium-rise, it's stricter. You usually need more than one staircase, positioned so that if one's blocked by fire or smoke, there's another way out.
So it's about having backup options, making sure everyone can get out safely no matter what.
Exactly. Medium-rise buildings might also need, like, sprinkler systems, more smoke detectors, things that can stop a fire quickly.
Yeah, putting out a fire in a taller building, that's got to be a lot harder.
Another difference is the structure, how strong it has to be. Medium-rise buildings, they get hit with more wind, they might experience earthquakes, so they have to be designed to withstand that.
So the higher you build, the stronger it needs to be. Makes sense. What about accessibility? Are there different rules for low rise and medium rise?
Yeah, accessibility is another area where the rules can change. Low-rise buildings, maybe they just need ramps or a lift for a few units. But medium-rise, with more floors, more people, they usually need lifts that go to every floor, wider corridors for wheelchairs, accessible toilets on different levels.
So again, it's about adapting the rules to the size and complexity of the building and thinking about who's using it.
Right, exactly. And these are just a few examples. Building regulations, they cover all sorts of safety things: ventilation, sanitation, sound insulation, energy efficiency. And the specific rules, they depend on what the building's for, where it is, how it's designed.
It's amazing how much goes into making sure buildings are safe for people.
It's a lot, yeah. It's complicated, but it's all about creating buildings that are safe, sustainable, accessible for everyone.
You've really explained how important building control is. It's not just red tape. It's about protecting people and making sure buildings are good quality.
I agree. Understanding these rules, it's crucial for anyone involved in building, whether it's the homeowner, the builders, the architects, developers. It's about working together to make buildings that are safe, sustainable, accessible.
Now let's zoom out a bit.
Mm.
What other legal things come into play with construction? We've talked about planning permission, building control, but what else is there?
Well, construction projects, they can have a big impact, on neighbors, on the whole community. So there are laws in place to manage that impact, protect everyone's rights.
Okay, let's untangle this legal web. What are some of the key things our homeowner, who's still thinking about that extension, should know about?
One of the most basic ones is occupier's liability.
Occupier's liability. Okay, that sounds serious.
It basically means that whoever is in control of a property, they have a legal responsibility to make sure it's safe for anyone who enters, whether it's guests, workers, even trespassers.
So our homeowner, they have to make sure the construction site's safe, not just for the builders, but for everyone, even the nosy neighbor looking over the fence.
Yep, exactly. This means taking reasonable steps to prevent accidents, like putting up signs, fencing off dangerous areas, making sure the site's tidy.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Don't want someone tripping over a pile of bricks and suing you.
Yeah.
So it's not just the building work itself, it's about making the whole property safe.
Exactly. And it's not just about safety during the construction, it also covers the condition of the property itself. The homeowner has to deal with any hazards that could be a risk to visitors, like uneven walkways, loose railings, things like that.
Okay, so occupier's liability, it's all about safety for everyone on the property. What else should homeowners know about legally when they're building?
Two other big ones are trespass and nuisance.
Trespass and nuisance. I can see how those could lead to problems with neighbors.
Yeah, definitely. Trespass is basically going onto someone else's property without permission.
So if the builders accidentally go onto the neighbor's lawn with a wheelbarrow full of cement, that's trespass.
That's right. Construction work, especially in tight spaces, it can sometimes lead to accidental trespass. Maybe workers go onto the wrong property. Maybe materials get stored in the wrong place.
Got it. And nuisance, what's that all about?
Nuisance is broader. It's anything that interferes with someone else's enjoyment of their property, and it has to be unreasonable.
So it's not just about physically going onto their property, it's about how the construction work affects them.
Yeah, exactly. Construction, we know it can be noisy, dusty, disruptive. If it gets to be too much, that's when it can become a legal nuisance.
I can imagine noise complaints are pretty common when there's construction going on. Jackhammers, all that. Not exactly peaceful.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah.
Loud machinery, hammering, all the usual construction noises, they can cause tension between neighbors, especially if it happens at the wrong times or goes on for too long.
So our homeowner, they'd need to be careful about noise levels, try to keep things as quiet as possible. What about dust and debris? I bet that can cause problems too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Dust and debris blowing from a construction site, that can be a real nuisance, especially if it lands on someone else's property. Imagine your freshly cleaned car covered in construction dust.
Yeah, that wouldn't make for happy neighbors.
Yeah.
So what can homeowners do to minimize all this?
Well, they can use things like, dust suppression techniques. They can cover up piles of materials, make sure they clean up any mess that gets off the site. It's about being considerate, taking steps to minimize the impact.
Right. A little bit of thoughtfulness can go a long way in preventing problems. So besides these general legal things, are there any specific rules or guidelines that encourage builders to be good neighbors?
There is, yeah. In the UK, we have the Considerate Constructor scheme. It's voluntary, but it encourages construction companies to go the extra mile, be really good neighbors, do more than the minimum the law requires.
So it's like a good neighbor award for
yeah.
construction companies.
Yeah, kinda. The companies that sign up, they agree to follow a code of considerate practice. It covers things like keeping the site clean, controlling noise, communicating with neighbors respectfully, making sure it's a safe working environment.
It's great that they have this scheme encouraging companies to be mindful, build good relationships with the community. But even when everyone's trying their best, sometimes things go wrong, accidents happen. That's where insurance comes in, right?
Absolutely. Construction projects, big or small, there are always risks. Insurance is crucial to protect everyone involved, from the homeowner to the contractors, from, financial losses.
Okay, let's talk insurance. What are the main types that homeowners need for a project like this extension?
One of the most important is public liability insurance.
Public liability insurance, okay. What does that cover?
It protects the homeowner if someone who's not part of the project, like a neighbor, someone walking by, if they get injured or the property gets damaged because of the construction work.
So if, like, a hammer falls off the roof and dents the neighbor's car, that's covered.
Exactly. It would pay for the repairs, legal fees, any compensation the neighbor might claim.
Sounds essential. I bet those costs could add up quickly if something went wrong.
You're telling me. Another important one is employer's liability insurance.
That one sounds pretty self-explanatory.
It is. Actually, it's required by law if you're employing people. It covers the costs if someone gets hurt at work or gets sick because of their job.
So the homeowner needs this to protect themselves if one of the builders has an accident on site.
That's right. It protects both the homeowner and their employees.
Now, there's another type of insurance mentioned in our sources. Contractors all risks insurance. What's that one all about?
Contractors all risks, or say our insurance. It's more specialized. It covers more things that can go wrong, specifically on construction projects.
So it's like an all-in-one policy for all kinds of mishaps.
Yeah, you could say that. Say our insurance can cover things like damage to the building while it's being built, theft of materials, damage to tools and equipment. Even if the project gets delayed or disrupted, you might be covered for that too.
Wow, that's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, it is. It's especially important for big projects, complex ones where a lot of money is involved.
And there's one more type mentioned, latent defects insurance. What are latent defects and why do you need insurance for that?
Latent defects, they're like hidden problems, flaws in the design, the materials, the way the building was built. But you don't see them until later, after the project's done.
So like those sneaky problems that come back to bite you.
Exactly. You might not see them during inspections, but then months, years later, they show up and you need expensive repairs.
Yeah, I can see why you'd want insurance for that.
Latent defects insurance, it covers those unexpected problems, usually for like 10 to 12 years after the building's finished. It can cover the repairs, legal fees, even compensation if someone who's living there later has problems because of the defect.
So it protects both the homeowner and anyone who might buy or rent the property later on.
Right, exactly.
Well, this whole discussion about construction insurance, it's been really eye-opening. Having the right insurance, it's so important it protects everyone involved.
Definitely. Insurance gives you peace of mind, you know? If something unexpected happens, you're covered. But beyond insurance, there's another layer of legal stuff we need to talk about. Land ownership. Who owns the land, what rights they have. That can really affect construction projects.
Okay, let's get into the world of land law. This is where things can get really complicated, right?
Land law in the UK, it has a long history, and yeah, it can be complex. But the basic idea is it defines who owns the land, what they can do with it, and how those rights can be transferred or limited.
It's about setting clear boundaries, knowing who has the right to do what with a piece of land.
Exactly. And in the UK, there are two main types of land ownership: freehold and leasehold.
Freehold and leasehold. Okay. I've heard those terms before, but I'm not sure I totally get the difference.
It's an important difference. Freehold, that's the simplest one. It means you own the land and any buildings on it completely. You can do whatever you want with it, use it, sell it, rent it out.
So it's like owning a piece of the earth. No strings attached.
Exactly. It's the most complete type of ownership.
And leasehold, how's that different?
Leasehold is a bit trickier. With leasehold, you own the right to use the property for a set amount of time, and that's all spelled out in a lease agreement.
So it's kind of like renting, but for a really long time with some extra rights.
That's a good way to think about it. The lease agreement, it lays out all the rules, how long the lease is, how much rent you pay, what you can and can't do with the property.
Okay, so our homeowner, building their extension, they need to know if they own the land freehold or leasehold. Why does it matter?
It matters because leasehold can have restrictions. The lease might say what changes you can make to the property, or it might say you need permission from the freeholder before you do any construction work.
So it's like having a landlord, even though you own the property in a way.
Yeah, that's right. And that leasehold agreement, it can really affect what you can do with your home.
Right, because you're essentially a tenant, even if it's a long lease.
Exactly. So if our homeowner's property is leasehold, they got to check that lease carefully before they start building, make sure they're not breaking any rules.
Good advice. It's always best to be prepared. The sources also talk about easements and freehold covenants as things that can affect construction projects. Can you explain what those are?
Sure. Easements and freehold covenants, they're legal things that can either give someone rights over land or restrict what you can do with it, even if it's your land.
Okay, let's start with easements.
An easement, it's basically a right that someone has to use another person's land for a specific purpose.
Can you give me an example?
A common one is a right-of-way. That means someone has the right to cross your land to get to their own property.
So if our homeowner's property has an easement that lets their neighbor walk across it, they can't just block that path with their new extension.
Nope, they can't. They'd have to design their project so it doesn't interfere with any existing easements.
Makes sense. And freehold covenants, what are those?
Freehold covenants are like agreements between landowners. They put limits on how the land can be used.
So it's about what you can't do with your own land rather than giving someone else rights to use it.
Exactly. Freehold covenants can have all sorts of restrictions, like limiting how tall buildings can be or saying what kind of businesses can operate there.
So if our homeowner's property has a covenant that says buildings can only be a certain height, they'd have to make sure their extension follows that rule.
Exactly. These covenants, they're legally binding, so homeowners need to know about them before they start any building work.
Well, you've really shown how complicated land ownership can be, all these legal things to consider. It seems like understanding this stuff is just as important as getting planning permission itself.
Absolutely. These legal details, they can be easy to miss, but they're super important to make sure projects are done legally and that no one's rights are being violated.
Now, there's a specific law that often comes up with construction, especially when it involves shared walls or boundaries. The Party Wall Act.
Ah, yes, the Party Wall Act. It's all about preventing those, those classic neighborly fights that can happen when someone builds something that affects the property next door.
Okay, tell me more. Why is this act so important?
It sets out clear rules for how neighbors should communicate and agree on things when the construction involves a party wall, a wall that separates two properties, or when someone's digging near their neighbor's property.
So it's about preventing misunderstandings, making sure everyone's on the same page?
Yeah, that's it. The act encourages neighbors to work things out amicably, and it gives them a clear process to follow if there are any disagreements.
Okay, I can see how that would be helpful. How does the Party Wall Act actually work? What do you have to do?
The first step is the homeowner who's planning the work, they have to serve a party wall notice to their neighbors. This notice tells them about the construction, what's being planned, and what rights they have under the act.
So it's like giving them a heads up, letting them know what's going on and how it might affect them.
Exactly. The notice has to be written, and it has to include all the important details about the work, like what kind of construction it is, where it'll be, how long it's expected to take.
And what do the neighbors do when they get this notice?
They have a few options. They can agree to the work in writing if they're happy with it. They can say they disagree if they have concerns or want to change some things, or they can just ignore it. But under the act, that's the same as disagreeing.
So there are different ways to respond, depending on how they feel about the work.
Right. The act encourages everyone to get along, but it also has a system for dealing with disputes if they happen.
So what happens if the neighbors have concerns? Or they just flat out say no to the work? Do they just start arguing over the fence?
Hopefully not. If there's a disagreement or the neighbors don't respond, then the act says they need to appoint a surveyor.
A surveyor. Okay, now it's getting serious.
The surveyor, both neighbors have to agree on who it is, or a third party can appoint someone. The surveyor's an expert. They look at the planned work, they listen to the neighbors' concerns, and then they write up a party wall award.
A party wall award. What is that exactly?
It's a legal document that explains all the details of the work, including any precautions that have to be taken to protect the neighbor's property.
So it's like a plan to make sure the work is done safely and without causing too much trouble for the neighbors.
Exactly. The award might include things like instructions for strengthening the foundations, adding supports, ways to control noise and dust, basically anything needed to protect the neighbor's property.
It's a pretty thorough system, designed to prevent those neighborly disagreements from turning into big legal fights.
It is. The Party Wall Act, it might seem like an extra complication, but it can really help keep things smooth between neighbors when there's construction going on.
Well, this deep dive into the Party Wall Act has been really informative. It seems like it's essential for anyone involved in construction, especially when it comes to shared walls or digging near boundaries.
It's all about communication, being fair, and keeping things positive between neighbors, especially during what can be a stressful time.
So even with all these laws and regulations, we know that disputes can still happen in construction projects.
Yeah, that's true. Construction's complicated, lots of things going on, tight deadlines, and sometimes people just don't agree. So yeah, disputes are bound to come up sometimes.
Okay, let's talk about construction disputes. What are some of the most common types of disputes?
One of the most common is payment disputes. Money, it can be tricky, especially with big projects, lots of money involved.
Money. Yeah, I can see how that could lead to arguments.
Disputes can happen over things like how much was agreed on for the work, if the project changes and costs more, or if payments are late.
So you got to have really clear contracts from the start to avoid any confusion later on.
You got it. A detailed contract, written clearly, that's the best way to prevent payment disputes. It should say exactly what work will be done, how payments will be made, and what happens if things change or if there are delays.
Right, because when money's involved, things can get heated pretty quickly. What other kinds of disputes happen? What else causes problems on construction projects?
Another common one is disputes over defective workmanship.
Defective workmanship. Okay. I imagine that would cover a lot of different problems.
It does. Disputes can arise over things like, were the right materials used? Was the work done to a good standard? Does the finished work actually meet building regulations?
So if our homeowner finds out their brand new extension has a leaky roof or cracks in the walls, that could be a dispute.
Exactly. In those cases, it's really important to have good evidence to support your claim that the work was defective. That might be photographs, reports from experts, detailed records of conversations with a contractor.
So if our homeowner finds out their brand new extension has a leaky roof or cracks in the walls, that could be a dispute.
Exactly. In those situations, it's really important to have good evidence to support your claim that the work was defective. That might be photographs, reports from experts, detailed records of conversations with the contractor.
Right. It sounds like documentation is key in these situations, so you have a clear trail of what was agreed upon, what work was actually done and when, and any problems that arose along the way.
Absolutely. Documentation is your best friend when it comes to construction disputes. It can help you build a strong case and hopefully avoid a messy legal battle. But even with meticulous record keeping, disagreements can still happen. So what are the options when a dispute rears its ugly head? Is it straight to court, or are there other ways to handle things?
Because, let's face it, nobody wants to get bogged down in a lengthy and expensive court case if they can avoid it. What are some of the alternative routes to resolution?
There are actually several alternative dispute resolution, or ADR, methods that are often more efficient and cost-effective than going to court.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of the most popular ADR methods used in construction disputes?
One common approach is mediation.
Mediation. Okay, I've heard that term before, but can you break it down for me? How does it actually work?
Mediation involves bringing in a neutral third party, called a mediator, to help the parties in dispute reach a mutually acceptable agreement.
So it's more about facilitating a conversation and finding common ground than having a judge make a decision.
Exactly. The mediator doesn't take sides or impose a solution. Their role is to help the parties communicate effectively, explore different options, and hopefully come up with a compromise that works for everyone.
It sounds like a much more collaborative and less adversarial approach than going to court. It seems like a good way to preserve relationships, which is important in the construction industry where people often work together on multiple projects.
Absolutely. Mediation is often the preferred method for resolving construction disputes because it can be quicker, less expensive, and less damaging to relationships than litigation.
And what about other ADR methods? Are there any other options besides mediation?
Another commonly used method is adjudication.
Adjudication, okay. How does that differ from mediation?
Adjudication is a bit more formal. It involves an independent adjudicator reviewing the evidence and making a binding decision on the dispute. It's generally a faster and less expensive option than going to court, but the adjudicator's decision is typically interim, meaning it can be challenged later on.
So it's a way to get a relatively quick resolution, especially when a project is ongoing and delays could be costly, but it might not be the final word.
Exactly. Adjudication can be a useful tool for keeping projects moving forward while still addressing disputes fairly.
It's fascinating to see how many options there are for resolving disputes outside of the courtroom. It's encouraging to know that there are more collaborative and efficient ways to handle disagreements.
Absolutely. The key is to understand the different ADR methods and seek professional advice early on to choose the best approach for your specific situation.
Well, this has been an incredibly informative deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from planning permission and building regulations to the legal complexities of land ownership, liability, and dispute resolution. It's clear that construction projects, even something seemingly straightforward like our homeowner's extension, operate within a complex legal web designed to balance individual rights with the broader interests of the community and the environment.
It's been a pleasure unraveling this web with you, and I hope our listener feels more confident and knowledgeable about navigating the world of construction law.
You've certainly given them a lot to think about. So until next time, remember to do your research, seek expert advice when needed, and build responsibly.
And always remember, the goal is to create a built environment that benefits everyone, from the homeowners and builders to the wider community and future generations.
Beautifully said. That's a wrap on this deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed this journey into the fascinating world of construction law. We encourage you to keep exploring, learning, and asking questions. Because the more you know, the better equipped you'll be to shape the world around you.